Now I have. Thank you for the reminder.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so as people continue to join us, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome. I'm Diana Brown, and I am the Prevention and Early Intervention Manager with RUHS Behavioral Health, and I am one of your Coalition Leadership Co-Chairs.
Yes, and good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Antion. I'm a program coordinator with our Injury Prevention Services branch within Public Health, and I am the other Coalition Leadership Co-Chair. Thank you all for joining us today. We do have a lot of things to cover in our meeting today. Many of our subcommittees have been meeting and coming together to work on activities and strategies since our kickoff meeting in October. And so we do want to go over just very quickly a glimpse of what our agenda will look like today. So we do have on our agenda a presentation by Mr. Noah Whitaker. We will also go through progress reports from our subcommittees. And then we will give an opportunity for you all to ask questions and maybe have some general discussion on any of the activities or items that are addressed. And then we will close for the day.
Okay. So when we developed our quarterly meeting schedule, we wanted to include learning opportunities to broaden knowledge and build expertise in suicide prevention best practices among our Suicide Prevention Coalition members. We are very lucky to be joined today by Noah Whitaker, who will talk to us about crisis coping theory and the suicidal crisis path, a context for understanding suicide risk and intervention. Over the last decade, Noah has served as the director of the Tulare County Suicide Prevention Task Force. Noah is considered an expert in community-based suicide prevention efforts, including the active postvention model, and leads the Tulare County Loss Team. So without further ado, I am going to hand over control to Noah. We're going to give this a try, Noah. See if I can find you and give you.
It works for me too if you just pin me, and then I can run this through my camera.
Oh, now you want me to get really fancy, Noah. Let me see if I can do this. I think you have the ability to forward slides now. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there are little arrows.
Yeah, it's kind of not correspondent on my screen.
Oh, you did that.
I'm moving it forward now.
Yes, you did it. I didn't do that.
Yeah, I can't see. Unfortunately, I can't see any menu on my side to forward it backwards or forward.
Okay.
Oh, wait, is that?
That's you.
Okay, there we go. I guess I can now. Arrow keys. All right. So what I'll do then, I'll change my camera view so that that's not distracting in the background. Because usually I just present directly through my camera.
Okay.
All right, so morning. My name's Noah Whitaker. And as was mentioned, I've led suicide prevention efforts in Tulare County. It's been about 13 years now. And before that, I worked for, now they're called Kern Behavioral Health and Recovery Services on their homeless outreach team. But also, when I was a young child, I grew up never knowing my grandfather, Jack, who had died by suicide. And that was pretty prominently discussed in my family. So it wasn't really hidden to us. But my senior year of high school, my own father shot and killed himself. So I'm a multiple loss survivor. And in the time I've worked in the mental health field, I've lost clients to suicide. some friends and other family members to suicide, but also have actively served on our loss team, which is local outreach to suicide survivors. And that's a team that goes in the aftermath of suicide losses to support the bereaved. And so this year alone, I've responded to at least a dozen suicides in our community and probably a few hundred suicides over the last few years. So I like to mention that in context because this is going to be a presentation that's about understanding a few different theories and how these theories interact. And these theoretical models are taken from some of the great minds in the field, like Dr. Frank Campbell of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who he really formed the active postvention model. And I'll kind of expound on one of his theories that's central to this presentation. Also the work of Dr. DeQuincy Lazine, who I had the great pleasure of working with in Fresno County. And Dr. Lazine sits as the chair with AAS of the survivors or lived experience. And DeQuincy has a phenomenal mind. So we took some of his theory as well and integrated it here. And really the goal is to help people understand the chain of risk and the opportunities to intervene and support. So one of the things I do like to clarify is I'm an MBA, but I find that whenever I present, for some reason, people listen to licensed individuals more. So that's my driver's license. I'm not a licensed clinician, but I have a license just for driving. But there's my email and my phone number also, if you'd like to reach out to me and get some additional details or information. I'm happy to help and be involved. And I also would like to give a special thanks to your social marketer who helped to interact with me and bring me before you this morning. So lots of people to say thank you to, and in particular, my wife, Lindsay, who we've been together since high school. She actually never met my father. We started dating a month after his death, but we've been together for more than 20 years and have 5 children. So I like to just kind of share this humorous map of California to help give people some context for the state, because I think these anecdotal things really can feed into our understanding of our communities and our perceptions. So I've spent most of my time in the middle of the state, where it's labeled as the area that's good for driving through. But you all are kind of down south and in a whole different part of the country, where, I mean, really, when you look at places like Riverside, across the entire globe, this is a community that people would love to come to, love to live in. Southern California, close to the beach, close to the mountains, near Los Angeles, those sorts of elements. So your community does have this mystique to it, which also can kind of set up a false hope or reality for people, because any community has challenges. But I think it's important to interject humor in presentations on suicide in particular. But one of the quotes that I've come across in the field is this one, and I absolutely love it. This was a quote by the QPR Institute, Dr. Paul Quinnett and his staff, and they created Question, Persuade, Refer, which is a very popular online and in-person training and does a great job for gatekeepers. But whenever I come in front of an audience, I like to share with them that suicide comes with a lot of value-laden beliefs and feelings. And in this circumstance in particular, a lot of people feel this burden of responsibility, but they've never really been trained in it. And when I speak with clinical audiences, this is a particular point of interest to me, because most clinicians, be they LCSWs, LMFTs, psychologists, or even up into psychiatrists, really have had little to no training on suicide whatsoever in their educational programs, which is mind-boggling to me, because these are the professionals that people are turning to for help for suicide risk, for depression and anxiety. And when I talk to clinicians, they've been trained on depression, they've been trained on anxiety, but suicidality is something that maybe was constrained to a single chapter in one of their books. So it's no wonder that we as a country struggle so much when we have a clinician shortage paired with a clinician education shortage. So it's a point that I like to stick out and say, you can't really be responsible for something you were never trained to prevent or trained to support. So I think training elements become essential in these efforts as well. So this is another model from Alan Tien that he allows me to use in presentations, and a big shout out to him. It's a very simplified model when people talk about like the tip of the iceberg. Well, folks don't really talk about too much what underlies the iceberg. And here we're looking sort of at the hierarchy of needs from Maslow, where we have our basic living conditions, but these add to risk. Different social factors contribute. We pile that on and develop some behavioral health problems. And what we see on the surface are these socially recognized problems. And under the surface are all of the feeders to that. Now, one of the other particular points I like to make in the field of suicidology is that if we address these underlying issues, well, we're not just addressing suicide, we're addressing a whole series of negative social outcomes. So this work can really have an impact broader than just the word suicide. And I like to mention that and highlight it because that underscores opportunities to partner, especially with non-traditional partners. Because here, if you're working with, say, like a school yoga program, you can help address some of the social factors. And by partnering with that, maybe the school-based instructors, not only are they teaching skills like mindfulness, and you can pull in other cognitive and dialectical behavioral therapeutic approaches to understand, but they also now can help be additional eyes on the ground, looking at these students' living conditions, behavioral health problems, and now you can kind of have this fluid communication network. So we'll explore some of the value to that. So the thrust of this presentation is going through these three theoretical models fairly rapidly because it's only a 45-minute presentation, and then showing how these models really interact to support one another and how you can employ that in your work, planning, prevention, intervention, postvention strategies. So the first model, or before I get to the models, I'd like to bring up this dress. So does anybody remember this dress? It really flourished online a few years ago. And the main question with this is, what color is this dress? So if you don't mind, in chat, just put the color that you believe the dress is. What do you see? White and gold, blue and black, gold and white, bronze. All right, I like that. Lavender and charcoal. There we go. Somebody's getting real specific. I love that. So this is interesting because, I mean, assuming that all of your monitors aren't wildly different in their calibration, we're staring at the same dress. So this is a lovely concept to keep in mind for the rest of the presentation. The dress is a fact. The colors that you're typing into the box is your perception of that fact. And here, in a group that presumably has kind of worked together for many, many months now, you have disagreement as to the facts. And this is important because that's what theoretical models really help us with, is to understand how to interpret the facts in a more consistent fashion. It also underscores the importance of this collaborative because we have different perspectives. And guess what? Nobody's wrong. Everybody is seeing the color that they're seeing, and they are right. Now, there are some biological reasons for this. For example, eyes perceive light based off of a series of rods and cones that are in the back of your retina. And the way the wavelengths reflect off of that is how you interpret color. Approximately 60% or so of women have 4 sets of these rods and cones, whereas almost all biological males have only 3 sets. So women have an ability to perceive many, many more shades of color than men do. It could also do with your diet. It could do with how well you slept last night. All of these things, these biological factors, can change your perceptions of the facts, and your perception of the fact dictates your action towards those facts. So this also is an important time to consider your stress levels, your anxiety levels, and how much you've rested when you're looking at going into decision-making capacities. So the first theoretical model that we'll explore is the social ecological model, which is one of the most popular and consistent models in public health. The second model that we'll take a look at is called the crisis coping theory. And this was developed by Dr. Frank Campbell again, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Frank ran the Baton Rouge Crisis and Intervention Center and founded the Lost Team model. And there's Discovery Channel documentaries and things like that about Frank. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. And I've had the opportunity to sort of mentor under Frank for many years. And this was a model that Frank was developing. And then with his permission, I adapted, because part of my education is in theater. And I really loved the way that the theory behind theater interacted with a model like this. So we'll walk through this model in a few minutes too. But really the key characteristics in this model is an ability to cope over time and different factors that influence your ability to cope. The third model that we'll take a look at, and this is the simplified view of the model, this is the suicidal crisis path model. And this was developed by Dr. DeQuincy Lazine, and we employed this in our work with Fresno County's Suicide Prevention Strategic Plan. So when DeQuincy and I were sitting down and talking about theory and talking about applying theory to prevention work in Fresno, it really was this light bulb moment that these different theoretical models, they dovetail together. And if we can understand each of the models and how the models can combine, it can really influence our ability to help our community understand suicide, as well as understand where these interventions can fit in. So this is what the combined model looks like. They're all just sort of smashed and layered together, and it looks like chaos right now. And that's my point, because hopefully by the end of the presentation, we'll kind of understand these models. But here's the combined model. So I guess since I've shown it to you, I've succeeded in my mission of introducing you to 3 combined models. So we can just go to questions now. Or I can walk through each of the models, we can get a better understanding of them, and then go to questions, which might be better. But I can open it up for some initial questions, because I like to make sure that I'm headed in the right direction with my audience. So if somebody would like to ask a question, now's a great time to do so. And let's see, I'll duck down in just a second so I can see if anybody put anything in chat. You do have access to the slides. I have provided a link. These slides are hosted in Google Slides, as well as a PDF. You're more than happy to have access to them. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll just sort of fly forward through this so that we can have some additional time for questions at the end. But really, if something pops up, do go ahead and put it in chat. I'll try my best to look, but maybe if one of the other hosts might just unmute and read a question if one pops up. It does not bother me whatsoever to get interrupted. I have 5 children. That's my life. It's constant interruption. So I would rather address questions and engage than get to my last slide. For a lot of reasons. For one, if you can't tell, I do absolutely adore using comedy in my presentations. And a lot of that stems from a quote that I came across a long time ago, which is, the heart of all good comedy is darkness. And comedy helps us to explore in a comfortable way very uncomfortable situations and topics. And certainly suicide can be a very uncomfortable topic. So my goal isn't to really offend anybody. It is more to help us to explore this topic with some comedy, and also just kind of help us to keep up to pace and paying attention with some humor infused every now and then. But in all the years I've been doing this work, that Key and Peele video really is the most phenomenal video I've stumbled across to talk about issues like bullying, domestic violence, and suicidality. So a video like that can also be applied through these theoretical models, so that now we have a great example to run through and see how theory impacts everyday life. So when we embrace something like the social ecological model to understand suicide, most often people are looking down at one of the center spheres in the model, which is the individual themselves. What is their psychological state? What is their risk profile? And our trainings tend to focus at the interpersonal level. Trainings like applied suicide intervention skills training, question, persuade, refer, safe talk, really most all of the gatekeeper trainings are about this interpersonal level. And how do we recognize the risk in others? And one of the reasons that approach is important is because there is some substantive research that shows as an individual becomes more suicidal, their ability to seek and receive help diminishes greatly. And they become more and more dependent upon external others to step in and assist them. But the external others can also be stressors. And we'll explore that a little bit more in a different model. The organizational approach really can change a lot of things. Does your organization express or embrace a specific training model like ASSIST or QPR? Do they have resources available? Many organizations, for example, if you lose somebody to any form of death, you get bereavement leave, which often is up to 3 days if you work in a pretty progressive entity. Now, you know, just this year, I lost one of my pets. He was run over. And I lost a very, very, very good friend who was a family member, basically, of mine, an adopted family member. And I can tell you, just with my dog, it took more than 3 days to recover from that, let alone from the death of my friend, which took much longer than that. So if you lose a close friend or family member, 3 days, that's not enough time to get your head back together, explore your emotional state, things like that. So even those kinds of organizational policies can have an impact on people's ability to cope. What about the community itself? Here you have a wonderful coalition. We have one in Tulare. There's one in Fresno that's very strong. Santa Cruz, Monterey, Sacramento. They're dotted across the state now, which is fantastic. But I can tell you a decade ago, there was like maybe 3 in the entire state. So at the community level, this issue is changing and transforming. And a lot of that has to do with the public policy level, with things like the Mental Health Services Act that brought about an infusion of funding that was desperately needed in the behavioral and mental health field. Without that legislation, we wouldn't have the funding for many of these programs. But more recently, we've seen legislation that requires the National Lifeline number on the back of physical student ID cards. We've seen the state come out with their strategic plan, their updated one on suicide prevention. We see policies requiring professionals to get training in suicide. Those public policies then filter down throughout this entire model and end up impacting the individual interpersonal. But the real thrust in this model is that each of these layers are essential, and you need to make plans across each of these layers and spheres to truly impact an issue like suicide. Next is crisis coping theory, which tends to be, this really has become one of my favorite models. And in crisis coping, again, we're looking at an ability to cope over time. Now, this is a framework for understanding, so I do want to point that out. And here, when we look over at the far, I'll say left of the model, where we see the word stasis, this is where I'm infusing from theater. Stasis is basically the story before the story begins or the action begins. And so often, if you think of, say, like an action film, stasis is already broken. Most action films start with a car chase or a gunfight or some other action sequence. You don't know what started it. You just know you're in an action sequence and things are flying. That is usually where crisis workers come in, which is further down in this model. But in somebody's life, this is just sort of the everyday background before action begins. So in this part of the model, we have our life stasis. Now we enter into this next period and we come into the model. And here in the model, you'll notice that my axes have no values attached to them other than high and low. And that is very specific because here we're looking at the overall trends and we're not using a specific tool or instrument to judge that. I leave that up to clinical judgment and organizational judgment on which tools to identify. So for example, in Tulare County, for many years now, we've run a program called the Older Adult Hopelessness Screening Program. In that program, when I was developing it, I used a double-blind study where I implemented the Beck Depression Inventory and the Beck Hopelessness Scale to see which one might be more effective, get higher response rates, and be more accurate when used as a screener and then further followed up with evaluation from a clinician. Ultimately, I landed on the Beck hopelessness scale because it had higher completion rates and tended to be about as valid as the depression inventory. But those tools helped clinicians look at the coping ability over time. So now when we look at an ability to cope, we see both stressors and we see supports. So the model might be kind of small on your screens. So to kind of truncate it, it's to say something like your relationships can really be a stressor, but they also can be supports. Your interpersonal relationships with your friends and your coworkers, those can be supports. They also can be stressors. Finances can be a support or a stressor. Substances can be a support or a stressor. It's very important to be clear on these, that we have an ability for anything to be a stressor or a support depending upon the context, and that relationship can change over time. But here, if we look on the time scale, and again, there's no values because this is dependent more on the individual than on specific measurements of time, like days, weeks, months, years, or even decades. But let's pretend that this is a day in a person's life. And here they wake up, they were headed to Starbucks, the line's super long, they decided to skip their morning coffee, now they're in a grumpier mood, their stressors have definitely increased and pushed down their ability to cope. They run a red light, they get pulled over, they get a ticket. Now they have this legal stressor as well as the financial burden, and they're running late. Their stressors are piling down on their ability to cope. They get to work, one of their favorite coworkers is there, and guess what? Their coworker happened to get them a Starbucks and a donut. This kind of helps now diffuse the stress they were under, and it's bringing their supports up. In this model, you start to enter into a hazardous atmosphere when you get a lot of frequency shifting. If you're going between supports and stressors very rapidly, that is a hazardous atmosphere and is different than stasis, unless that's the person's everyday life is a hazardous atmosphere. But that's fairly uncommon for most people. Most people sort of live a life of stability, and then they step into numerous stressors. So in this situation, we sort of have this uptick in ability to cope, followed with a downtick of some sort of stressful situation. And then we step into what's called the precipitating event. And this is kind of interesting because the word crisis comes from Greek Latin, crises, and really just means a point in which something has happened that forces change for the good or for the bad. And that's what a precipitating event is. It is a crisis defined by the individual. For some people, it might be something like, I lost my dog, and that was a 16-year-old dog I raised from a puppy. Other people would be like, you lost your dog, dude, like, get over it. It's just a dog. But that was part of my family. So that's the importance of really embracing that precipitating events and crises are self-defined, because what you might find to be a crisis, just like that dress, I might not find to be a crisis. I might find something else. This is the importance of that interpersonal relationship from the social ecological model of other people observing and checking in with the individual. In this circumstance, though, we'll call the precipitating event a loss to suicide. It is a very clear event that has occurred and has now thrust this person into a crisis. And what you see immediately is their ability to cope plummets, especially relative to their normal level before the precipitating event. We now have entered into this crises period, and an ability to cope has been so deeply impacted that an individual that doesn't normally struggle with thoughts of suicide might begin to have ideation or thoughts or feelings of wanting to die, whether those are active, like I'm going to shoot myself with a Colt 45, or they could be passive, such as, I just don't want to wake up tomorrow. I wish this would all go away. That suicidality can start to become present. Now, often what we see at the onset of a crisis is artificial supports step in. For some people, this could be supports from their faith-based community or their friend network, coworkers, or neighbors. This is sort of one of the things where when a person dies, your refrigerator might get filled up with casseroles or enchiladas or other things like that, is all these people are trying to bring you food. They wrap around you. You might get a call from a best friend or somebody. Hey man, I heard you went through this. I'm here for you. Well, once they see your ability to cope sort of starts to come back up because of all of these artificial supports, often people will start to back off now. They don't want to feel intrusive, or maybe they start to get burned out. They have their own lives to live, but they see that you're supported and they back off, or your 3 days of bereavement leave is over, or similar circumstances. Well, your crisis wasn't resolved. You just had some temporary respite, and now that respite and those supports are gone. The stressors are still there. So you plummet right back down into crises and suicidal thoughts. And sometimes this can even be deeper than the immediate following the crisis, because you saw some supports and now they're no longer there again. It's during this time period that those thoughts, or this suicidal ambivalence, do I want to die? Do I want to live? That can enter into the equation. Now here, the outcomes from this are really simplified into 4 areas. You can have adaptive strategies, which as a result of having come through this crisis, you might have embraced things like your faith community, or you might have gone to grief and bereavement counseling. Perhaps you engaged in cognitive behavioral therapy, or maybe you had a visual element to your trauma. So you went through EMDR therapy to help you reprocess those thoughts and that trauma. And as a result, you come out a stronger individual than before. Perhaps you just sort of get your life back together and you enter into your quote unquote new normal. That's restorative. So when you look back to the left of the model, you see that the daily ability to cope is roughly now at about the same as it was before. You've returned to stasis. Maladaptive strategies are very, very common, especially among suicide loss survivors. Here you've turned to drugs or alcohol, escapism. You might turn to sexuality or other outlets that, in all honesty, can be highly effective at helping an individual cope in the short term, but are highly ineffective in the moderate to long term. And the long-term ability to cope is severely diminished and often has higher frequency and shift between stressors and supports as well. And the most negative outcome in this scenario is a suicide. The interesting thing about a model like this is that suicide death now almost instantly becomes the precipitating event for somebody else. And if we look in closed systems like schools or some work environments, like say in the prisons among prison guards or correctional officers, we can see an event that's referred to as contagion, in which there is a rapid amount of suicides that are related in a small enclosed community. And this is part of that cycle from suicide to precipitating event, suicide to precipitating event. It skips a large section of the model and enters into a negative feedback loop. That's why it's important that once you see 2 or 3 suicides in a closed community, to really come alongside of that community and understand what's driving these deaths and how these can be disrupted through some additional supports. Now, then you reach your resolution, and that becomes your new stasis, and you enter back into the other side of the model. The suicidal crisis path. Oh, sorry, my computer just kind of froze for a second. So the suicidal crisis path is a model that it really intends to integrate multiple theoretical approaches and frameworks within the context of an individual's suicidal experience. Using a model like this can really help us to understand the context and opportunities to intervene by matching your resources and protective factors appropriately. This is a simplified view of the model, and we'll sort of step through the expanded view in the next few slides. Sorry, it's the clicking thing. Again, Here, it's important to keep in mind the context of the social ecological model as we go through each of these phases. Just think of this as underlying in the background, the interplay through these different hierarchies of our society and how public policy, organizations, communities, our interpersonal relationships, all of that can influence each step and phase within this model. Oh, my controls are delayed apparently. So some of the main mechanisms that generate risk from the environment or experience, they're illustrated in this slide in particular. And here, if you look at the top, we're looking at those first two steps within this model. And we're looking at things like the hazardous environment, which you'll remember from the crisis coping model. And we're looking at these underlying characteristics, biology, life events. Many fields of study like biology, psychology, sociology, they've produced theory and research that really help to explain the specific experience and the contextual factors that contribute to the types of hazards in the environment. And these hazards are what can help generate the suicide risk. Generally, negative experience and risk, they build over time and they culminate in the suicidal event. These studies have identified several elements, such as a desire to die, an intent to die, suicidal capacity, as well as buffers or protective factors. And here you would see this really in works like the suicidal mind, which are like, theoretical models by folks like Dr. Thomas Joyner in his interpersonal theory of suicide, which heavily influenced this model as well. And his model proposes that an individual really won't die by suicide unless they have both a desire to die as well as the acquired capacity to die. So experiences that can result in feelings of defeat, humiliation, feeling like a burden, especially if you're feeling like a burden to others, or intense loneliness, as we see in our older adult population, these can all be critical factors. And exploring these elements is the basis of many risk assessments and really also the basis of the 5150 process. If they're a danger to self, do they have a plan? Do they have a means? Do they have an intent? That is all contained within the interpersonal theory. Now we step into the next two, higher risk and suicidal. And again, we pull in the precipitating event from the crisis coping theory. There's a special group of proximal risk markers or immediate vulnerabilities that can act as indicators or clues that a person might currently be suicidal. This doesn't mean that they'll have a suicide attempt or a completion. It just indicates they may be suicidal. Some of these reflect the way that people try to deal with increasing distress before they turn to suicide. And others indicate that a person might be at the stage of intending to die. These hints might be displayed as what individuals would call warning signs. So we're not really looking at the risk factors, that was earlier. Now we're looking at the warning signs. And people display common warning signs. I still do like the American Association of Suicidology's ISPath-WARM model, which is ideation, substance abuse, purposelessness, anxiety, feeling trapped, feeling hopeless, withdrawal, anger, recklessness, and mood shifts. Woo, I remembered it. Those are all great warning signs. And I'm always like, pat on the back, I remember. I think that's the trick, though, is you have to remember the mnemonic. But it's still great warning signs, and they have like wallet cards and things like that that you can use, especially with models like applied suicide intervention skills training. They give you a pocket card that you can refer to, not only for some of these risk factors, but for how to have the conversation. That's also what QPR focuses on, is recognizing these warning signs. And you're looking at hopelessness, emotional pain, feeling trapped, feeling burdened, those sorts of elements. Now, we're looking between suicidal and suicide attempts at this point, and we're looking at the capacity, the capability, impulsivity, and things like that. So here, when we look at the capability of attempting suicide, we're really looking at the mental, emotional, and physical preparation to overcome what is arguably our strongest biological drive, which is the drive to survive. And because of their emotional pain, their chemical imbalance, or other factors, they have overcome one of the strongest human biological drives. To me, it is absolutely amazing that anybody dies by suicide, because that drive to survive is so strong and it gets disrupted. Capability and access to means, they contribute to the risk. And then the main factor that determines whether a person will make a suicide attempt concern the intent to act. And intent is very important, because this makes the difference between an accidental death and a purposeful death. This makes the difference in a ruling between, say, a drug overdose by accident or a suicide by substances. There exists within all of us that sort of natural drive to survive. So when that threshold is lowered, these behaviors and traits can also become a little bit more noticeable, and you can find things like increasing anxiety, rehearsal in particular. Either they're holding a gun, they go to a gun range, they're driving by a bridge, they stop by the railroad tracks. They're doing other sort of things to prepare for taking that leap or that act. Other folks can be very, very impulsive, and that can be more difficult or challenging to interact. And in fact, in our community, many years ago, there were these two teenagers, and they were playing with a firearm. The firearm went off, instantly killing one of the teens. The other teen, who just lost his best friend in front of him, panicked and immediately picked up the firearm and shot and killed himself. That was an impulsive act that could not have been predicted and couldn't have been prevented outside of means restriction. If they wouldn't have had access to the firearm, that was the only possible way of preventing that suicide. But that impulsivity in others can be a very big challenge too. This can happen with bad news things. Honey, I'm leaving you, or guess what, you're fired. Any unexpected life event can trigger in somebody who's impulsive, and they can take very rash actions. The essence of this is to explore where the threshold is and if the capability is increasing, the capability to die. So we're examining thoughts and behaviors that can precipitate an event, as well as their access to highly lethal means. That's one of the interesting kind of characteristics when you look between male and female suicides, is men by and at large tend to use more highly lethal means like firearms, and women tend to use less highly lethal means like ligature or hanging or pills, which provide more opportunities to intervene. So men tend to die by suicide 4 or 5 times higher than women, but women attempt suicide about 4 to 5 times more than men. So this is important too, because when we look back at that dress and you ask a coroner what suicide looks like, and you ask an EMT what suicide looks like, they have two very different perspectives of the same fact. So here, when we move from, when we move along into the suicide attempt and the suicidal act, the suicidal crisis path continues by specifying 2 key factors that determine if an attempt will be fatal. This is basically the last window for an intervention. One of the aspects to consider is the lethality of the attempt itself, or how likely it is that a death would occur if no intervention were to take place. Now, again, if you're looking at something like a gunshot wound, with no intervention, chances are that that person will die or will have a serious lifelong injury. But with overdoses, sometimes they're not lethal and a person can recover without ever receiving medical care or intervention. It's important to note that planned suicides, they tend to fixate upon a specific means. A person will gravitate towards something like a firearm or even a specific bridge. And there is a study between like the Jefferson and Washington bridges back east that they are right next to each other. In fact, they kind of spoke out from a central hub, and access from one bridge to the other, it's about 15 or 20 feet. Well, they had a significant amount of people who jumped off of one of the bridges and not the other. And it took them a few years, but they put up a barrier basically just a fence that kind of curves inward on one of the bridges, and the suicide deaths from that bridge pretty much ceased completely. 15 feet over on the other bridge of an identical height over the same river with the same construction, suicide deaths did not increase. People, for whatever reason, were fixated on that specific location. And when access to that location was removed, suicide deaths not only didn't occur at that site, but overall through the city, suicide deaths declined by the number of deaths that declined from that one bridge. So people didn't switch to other means. That is one of the key concepts with means restriction overall. When you have somebody who's highly impulsive, though, fixating on a specific means usually isn't present. They're highly impulsive. They will grab for whatever means are at hand. And we've seen this with people stepping out into traffic or in front of trains or things similar to that. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is planned suicides tend to gravitate towards more highly lethal means. And again, this is an opportunity for means restriction. The fatality is the amount of time it takes to die. So ingestion of poisons tends to act more slowly than a gunshot, which is immediate. And again, this is important because the longer that you have from a suicidal act to a death to intervene, the higher your chances of saving that life. So when we look between rural and urban, that tends to be a problem too, because in urban areas, there tends to be a more rapid access to emergency medical technicians and emergency rooms, whereas in rural communities, it can take 15, 20, 45 minutes, or if they're in the mountains, a few hours for an emergency medical technician to reach them. So something in an urban area that might not have been a lethal attempt, say from ingestion of poisons, in a rural area could very easily become a death simply because there's not enough time to intervene. If a suicide death occurs, this has a significant and generational increase in risk among those who are now termed survivors of suicide loss. And that term really comes from obituaries when you would see, John Smith died on this date, survived by. That's where that term survivor comes from. It's literally from the obituaries. Those loss survivors, they face a unique grief journey, different than any other form of death. And this is another contextual thing to understand, that when I'm working with suicide loss survivors, I generally recommend to them that they not go into general grief support groups, because I've seen it and I've experienced it, where they'll be in a group and somebody will share that they just lost a loved one to cancer, and this person shares that they lost their loved one to suicide, and they can get comments like, well, but your loved one chose to die, mine didn't. You've just completely shut down the healing process for that individual and closed them off. And that's where it's important that the peer supports come in, because truly no one can understand what it is like to go through the thoughts and feelings of losing somebody to suicide other than someone who has lost a person to suicide. And Ed Schneidman, the sort of father of the field of suicidology, he has a lovely quote that I love, which is, a benign community ought routinely provide postvention. And this is a notion that these folks now have a significant increase in their lifetime suicide risk, and we have a highly identifiable event. Ergo, if we're not intervening, we are increasing lifetime risk for suicide in our entire community. So this is that sort of run through of the suicidal crisis path. So now we'll look at the interrelationship again at these three theoretical models. So it really helps you to see where these interventions can take place. So here we have the layered model between the crisis coping theory and the suicidal pathways. And now you can see, when you just simply stack the two models on top of each other, how they correspond directly. And these correspond back into the slides, into those individual slides through the suicidal crisis path that we walked through. So you'll be able to sort of look at that and analyze that a little bit more. But this tells us that on the left side of the graph, We can look at working with stressors and supports. We can look at an individual's background profile or their stasis. Here, you can also think of stasis as something like ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. We're eliciting from their non-modifiable background as to how that influences their present and how we can modify how they deal with the traumas experienced in their stasis, or again, in adverse childhood experiences. So this is where you can see some of those programs mentioned down at the bottom. This is where you can offer things like EMDR or trainings around sudden and traumatic loss and help people work through their traumas so that you can disrupt the suicidal pathway early on and suicidality will not develop. But here we can also look in crises situations. Does a person have access to highly lethal means? Do you have programs for means restrictions? Are you looking at things like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the National Sporting Shooters Foundation? They have a combined packet for means restriction that you can use. Or from the East Coast, you can look at programs like the Gun Shop Project and see if those programs might work in your community. Or you can shuffle up the social ecological model, and maybe we have additional means restriction legislation that steps into place. Sorry, I don't think I can control the slide forward again. Perfect. So the suicidal crisis path and connecting to theory again, and this is just simplifying some of those elements from the crisis coping theory. We're looking at the stasis. This is where prevention and wellness promotion fits in. Between higher risk and suicide, this is where early intervention programs fit in. Through a suicidal individual before a suicide attempt, you can have your clinical interventions and your crisis responses. This is also where trainings like ASSIST and QPR can come into place and fit. And in a suicide attempt, the emergency rescue programs. Have you had interactions with your EMTs, with your emergency departments, or emergency rooms? There are things like the emergency room program, which gives some charts and things that can be placed in emergency departments so that those staff can be educated. We have a psychiatric residency program at one of our central hospitals, and I come in and I educate the psychiatrists about suicidality, which again, to me is mind-boggling because I'm an MBA, but the psychiatrists hadn't been trained in suicidality. So do you have programs in place to reach into there? And this can also be on simple things like etiquette and how do you interact with a person who has just attempted suicide? Because I have personally seen it with individuals in which they have ingested medications and the EMTs are exceedingly rough to them. They're not gentle. They're not putting the stomach pump down in a fashion that I would consider humane. And when I've asked them about it, some of them said, well, they're taking up my time because I could be working on a person who, was in an automobile accident or didn't want it. And instead I'm with this person. So I want to show them the mistake that they've made. And it's like, whoo, the medical profession might not be suited for you. You might want to explore some other things because this is not humane treatment. But I have literally seen that. And I've talked to a lot of EMTs and other medical professionals that hold that ideology. That's part of the dress again. They have a very different perception of the facts. And when a suicide occurs, do you have plans or strategies for postvention? Because postvention becomes the earliest form of intervention, as we've seen in our other models, because it is recursive and the survivor's risk for suicide is elevated. Do you have peer support programs? Do you have a loss team? In our community, when we first started our suicide prevention efforts, one of the very first things that I did is I took a look at access to grief and bereavement counseling. And we used some of our Mental Health Services Act monies to contract with clinicians to specifically offer grief and bereavement counseling to those bereaved by suicide death. And the length of time from the death doesn't matter. It could have been a week ago. It could have been 3 decades ago. If somebody is willing to approach grief counseling, we 100% paid for the service, regardless of the individual's ability to pay, insurance, any of that. There's no copays. We pay 100% and we remove every possible barrier to their engagement in that service. And this is not, as a behavioral health department, our quote unquote normal service population, because they don't have one of the big 5 diagnoses, but we saw the value of this. And in our community, if you were to individually seek clinical care, usually you're facing a wait from 1 to 3 months to get in to see somebody. With this program, because of the way we've contracted it, individuals who express a need are seen within 1 to 2 weeks at most. It's a phenomenal program. But this lets you look at any of the plans that you've made through your committees and subcommittees and see, this is where my work plugs in, or this is maybe a blind spot that we've got, and maybe we can address this area, or our work applies in multiple areas, and your work groups can kind of create a fusion as a result of that. So this again just expands out that other view, which was truncated before, and the intent is really, again, just to reinforce the way that these models interact and help us understand the normal course of our own ability to cope over time, but also how our ability to cope in our experiences can be along that suicidal crisis path. And again, when we step out and we look at the beginning of the presentation at what was most certainly an absolutely chaotic looking slide, hopefully now it makes a lot more sense, where crisis coping theory and the suicidal path are in lockstep with one another as far as identifying experiences and ability to intervene in programmatic elements, while keeping in mind the social ecological model and how you need to plan for individual, interpersonal, organizational, community-based, and public policy-based approaches to prevention and programs. So that gets us through the slide deck. Now we can embrace some question and answer and conversation.
I have a question.
Sweet,
can you hear me? Yes? Okay.
Yep.
I'm trying these headphones out for the first time today. So I'm from Riverside County Office of Education, and everything that we do comes under the umbrella of multi-tiered systems of support. So when I see your diagrams, I can put it in there as tier 1 would be prevention, tier 2 intervention, tier 3 postvention. Is that acceptable?
I do. That's actually, I address educational approaches in a different presentation, but you are 100% along the right alignment. Is it indicated, selected, et cetera? That's kind of the language you're speaking now. 100% you're on that path, yes.
Great, thank you.
The other intent with this too is with this understanding, this lays out a logic model for you. Because all you have to do is show, here's the suicidal crisis path or the crisis coping theory. Here's the intervention that we are planning and how we anticipate it to impact downstream. That's a logic model. And while I'm waiting for another question, I guess I'll just mention that with education in particular, and how I did mention ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, that now is really flourishing in the public health realm. So if school districts and behavioral health departments aren't also partnering with public health on ACEs, there is a massive opportunity to do that.
Yeah, we are doing that here in Riverside County.
Oh, fantastic.
Noah, my name's Dr. Miller, and I'm on the postvention committee. And I have a question related to, do you have a partnership with the coroners in your county? How do you, follow those that, as far as survivors, how did you get that set up in your county?
Sure. So I do have a partnership with our coroner, and whenever a suspected or probable suicide death occurs, he calls me on my cell phone as well as any of his detectives. We also have another sort of trigger at our operations level when a call is received that can trigger into a loss team response as well. But most often it's through a direct partnership with our coroner's office. And then I also work with our different mortuaries. But it really is a fantastic relationship now. This is our third or fourth coroner in the time that I've done this. And each coroner has passed that torch along to the next. And they actually are our biggest champions themselves. Because one of the things that the coroners see is at the scene, after they're there with a specific job to process the scene, to conduct an investigation, and then to leave and go on their next call. So their deputies would constantly share with us how bad they felt because they see this family that was just decimated by a loss, and now they've got to go on another call. Well, our team arrives, we do active postvention, which means when the call comes in, we dispatch our team almost like first responders. And I've even arrived on scene before law enforcement. In which case I wait for the scene to be contained and then I approach. But when we're there, we're engaged with the family. We're collecting information also, and we're assisting the coroner with their understanding of what took place. Our coroners and our investigators have been through psychological autopsy training, which is now offered at the National Suicidology Training Center in Louisiana. And they have an in-depth understanding of the drivers of suicide. And that helps them to more accurately do their investigations and gives us a more accurate understanding of suicide deaths. So at our level, even our suicide data comes directly from the coroner's office. And that includes things like their toxicology screens, known motivation, what their employment was, the number of survivors present at the scene. And we are able to track all of that through that direct relationship with law enforcement.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Noah?
Hi, my name's Pamela. Thank you for the presentation, Noah. It's very educational. One of the things that stood out for me was what you were talking about with the emergency medical person. And it just kind of shined a bright light. I think even in behavioral health, I'm a senior peer support specialist. Even in behavioral health, you hit on it a little bit. You have stigma around suicide, and then the institutional stigma in the medical field as well. And that thought process of here's somebody who's trying to die and I'm wasting my time. And so, I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do here is educate, all the different systems and reduce the stigma around it. And so it's just kind of curious, like, do you have you established anything? Like, do we have any training programs? Or has anybody put any training programs out there that we can look at that actually talk about stigma reduction around suicide?
I think part of that does come through trainings like ASSIST in particular tends to be one of my favorites, but it's a 2-day training and that's incredibly hard to get that time. It's also an expensive training, just to be honest. But there's also trainings like mental health first aid, which can go a long way towards that. And mental health first aid does have they're basically like components or drop-in modules that are specific to things like emergency medical technicians, firefighters, et cetera, where they kind of lightly brush a cultural competency lens on it. But in all honesty, I find that it's through volunteering, it's through coming alongside these folks and sort of showing them the truth rather than teaching them the truth that you begin to elicit champions within those organizations and entities. And your champions are the ones that start to help to shift culture. Because organizational culture, and this comes from my MBA kind of side, it comes from internal change and not external entities trying to force change. So that's really where some of those components can come in. And often it's because an individual experiences a loss that their eyes are now opened and they become more willing to become champions. But I think also, you know, very near and dear in Riverside, you have Dee Hirsch. And at Dee Hirsch, there's Dr. Nina Guten. And Nina runs the clinical survivor portion of the American Association of Suicidology. And that clinical survivor is a very important group, like you're discussing, that can have a lot of stigma placed on them. I'm a therapist. I lost a client to suicide. Have I failed as a professional? There's a whole series of things that come along with that. And so even those peer support networks can be vitally important. So, you know, offering in a region as big as Riverside, you have a lot more population to pull from in order to form these pocketed peer groups. I would consider that as a potential strategy to first work on just building up peer networks overall, and then looking into some specific pockets of how now you can more deeply penetrate into some of these organizations or professions by using their insiders who want to make change.
Thank you.
Sure. I know I sure am excited about hearing also from your guys' work groups, because I just love to learn what communities are doing and where you're at in your work and things like that. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to come before your coalition and engage with you very, very rapidly, I think, through some complex theory. But hopefully this gives you at least a better feel for how some of these programs can interact, how they can support one another, and the importance of looking across the spectrum rather than just in one or two areas, but how all of these things can work together, and how even things like art programs in schools can help in suicide prevention strategies. So one of the biggest sort of dress moments that I'll leave you with is this notion to think about suicide prevention does not need to even incorporate the word suicide to prevent. So thank you for your time. If there's any additional questions, I'm happy to field them. I don't want to take up too much time from your meeting, but you know, you also, I've provided my cell number and my email. I'm happy to help in any way I can. So thank you for entertaining me this morning.
There's a question that came in from the chat, but it is from Curly Palmer, and they're asking, it has been difficult to engage some of the faith-based leaders around this area of suicide prevention. Do you have any recommendations or best practices to share?
Sure. There is an older document that was put out by the Suicide Prevention Resource Center that is a multi-faith approach to suicide prevention. I think that document's at least like a decade old now. Living Works also has an individual that focuses on faith-based communities and sort of that conversation. As you get into postvention, one of the things you'll discover very rapidly as well is that many law enforcement entities are supported by chaplains. There's a faith-based entrance. In Southern California, Saddleback Church with Pastor Rick Warren, he lost his son to suicide, I think about 6 or 8 years ago, could be longer, COVID time. But his church really took some very significant and meaningful steps towards approaching this topic. They also have a wonderful YouTube channel that has a lot of information about behavioral health, psychology, medications, and faith. And I think it's very, very well organized. In some of the other broader Christian faiths, there is a training regimen that's called Stephen's Ministries, or Stephen Ministers. That program actually does have a chapter on suicide prevention. So I've worked with local churches and other faith organizations that have gone through Stephen's Ministries. And I come in and I provide a more focused education in that area of suicide and suicide prevention. Other strategies in our community we've run, now we do it twice a year. We call it From the Pulpit. in which it is very specific outreach to the faith-based community. And we interact with our Latter-day Saints and the stake leader in our area. We interact with the Catholic Church. We have a Buddhist temple here. We try and go out and have our representatives engage in conversation with them, find out where they're at and what their desires are, and then we develop a program to match where they're at rather than us try and prescribe a program to them. So it's a very collaborative approach.
Yeah, these are some conversations we've started having in our postvention subcommittee. And so, yeah, really good stuff. We'll definitely probably reach out to you again for some more tips. And I just want to thank you, Noah, so much for this terrific presentation. And if you are able to stick around for the remainder of our time together, we will have our subcommittee share out some progress. And if questions come up as you guys are hearing what we're doing and reflecting on Noah's presentation, if you're able to stick around, Noah, maybe we can take additional questions at the end of our time together this morning.
Sure. Yeah. With the faith-based community too, the other interjection there is also in the military, they have their chaplaincy service as well. So do take a look. I think if you're looking at penetrating into faith, use the door of the chaplains as the first knock.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Absolutely. Okay, thank you. I am going to move us forward so we have enough time to hear from the rest of our coalition. So before we dive into those report outs and updates, though, I wanted to review the organizational structure of our coalition and highlight a slight change that we've had in one of our subcommittees. So as we've mentioned earlier, coalition leadership is provided jointly with behavioral health and public health. That's me and Rebecca. Identified behavioral health and public health staff continue to help support the co-chairs in their subcommittee work. So this includes clerical support from Melissa, Katie, Miriam, Robert, Monique, and Kalia, as well as liaison support from Mary, Bianca, Andrea, Mindy, and myself and Rebecca as well. We also have the following subcommittees. It's our effective messaging and communications with co-chairs Jen Carson and Sarah Rodriguez that we'll hear from in a few minutes. Measuring and sharing outcomes with co-chairs Susanna Juarez-Williamson, Amy Wong, Lily Gallegos, and Jocelyn Franco. Our upstream focus subcommittee covers the strategic approaches of healthy and connected communities and promoting resiliency with co-chairs Cherie Summers and Shore Denny. Our prevention focus, this subcommittee includes two strategic approaches that while in the prevention arena was a lot of ground to cover for a single subcommittee. So this subcommittee decided to split into two separate work groups. The first focusing on trainings with our co-chairs Tashani Finnegan and Stephanie Lassane, and the second focusing on engaging schools with co-chairs Dr. Kathleen Sarmiento and our newly appointed co-chair Matthew Fraley. So welcome Matthew to the Suicide Prevention Coalition. Thanks for stepping in to help us co-chair this work group. We'll hear more from them in a moment as well. And our intervention focus subcommittee covers the strategic approach of means safety and expansion and integration of suicide prevention in health services. Our co-chairs are Jim Grisham and Joanna Armendariz. And then last but not least is postvention subcommittee that focuses on that much needed area of postvention in Riverside County, led by our co-chairs, Dr. Jill Miller and Brenda Scott. So now, please go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So now we're going to transition to have our subcommittees share out on their goals and accomplishments. This is an opportunity to break down silos, to look for partnerships between our different subcommittees, and to see where we can, work together to bridge the gaps in order to advance our work and the goals that have been developed in our strategic plan. So if we move on. So we're going to start off with our safe and effective messaging subcommittee, and we have Jen Carson and Sarah Rodriguez, who will be sharing a little bit about the work that their subcommittee has embarked on to address the goal of increased safe reporting of suicide and healthy social media use. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen and Sarah.
Hi everyone, it's Sarah Rodriguez here. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing. We've met a few times already We have also split into 2 separate work groups. We have one subcommittee work group focused on drafting suicide-safe content, and that group is mainly composed of people in the behavioral health sectors who have that kind of specialty and that knowledge. We have another work group focused on public relations best practices, and that's going to be people who are mainly focused on, in their day-to-day jobs, public relations, communications. And so we're working together. And our goal is to produce a safe messaging social media toolkit for media and social media and prevention for, in preparation for Suicide Prevention Week in the fall. So if there are any questions, just let us know. We're very excited.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next we'll move to talk about our Measuring and Sharing Outcomes Subcommittee. So to recap, the goal in the strategic plan, it includes advancing data monitoring and evaluation, which may include partnering with the coroners and medical examiners to develop a method for accessing data to improve suicide prevention strategies. So I'll turn to Susanna, Lily, Amy, and Jocelyn. Can you please share with us about the work of your subcommittee?
Hi, this is Susanna Warris-Williamson. We filled out kind of an action plan and really have an overall goal of becoming the coalition's go-to source for data requests and becoming a vetting source for data to ensure it's in line with our strategic plan and approach, and to work on providing some data briefs, presentations, and reports that instill effective messaging and represent a countywide story. We want to attain more real-time data to better inform program planning and expand our data sources and types of data. We want to create methods to shape and share our county story and create kind of these standard briefs that can routinely be updated so we can be better prepared to respond to requests for data. And then we possibly want to develop a strategic plan report card for Suicide Prevention Week. We've already made some headway with developing a Google Drive page for a spreadsheet that we started to list all of our data sources. Our public health partners have been really great with sharing some data to get at more current data, and have created an ArcGIS dashboard with more current data that we can't get readily available to us on the state EPI site, and it gives a lot of data for suicide and suicide attempts with much more current real-time data, so we love that. And we want to be able to use that internally to kind of inform these briefs and other data requests. And then we want to explore other data sources to get at risk factors and looking at needs in the community that can be correlated with higher suicide risk. Figuring out if we can obtain suicidal ideation data sources, screening data, help-seeking data, other kinds of sources. And so that's kind of where we're at, and we feel like we've made significant progress.
Awesome, thank you for that update.
Wow, that's amazing work that's taking place there. Okay, so we have our upstream focus, which includes our subcommittee co-chairs, Cherie Summers and Shore Denny, and they will be sharing a little bit about the work that has taken place to address creating healthy and connected communities and promoting resiliency here in our county.
Awesome, thank you, Rebecca, for having us on. Shore and I are going to be sharing today's report out, and I'll go ahead and kick us off here. So broadly speaking, just to remind everybody, the upstream subcommittee's focus is on prevention and wellness efforts that would build a more connected and resilient community. Because we know that having a sense of belonging and having the coping and problem skills associated with resilience are actually protective factors that can guard us against depression and suicide risk. So right after the kickoff meeting, our committee began meeting right away. We were small but mighty, and we actually began meeting twice a month for those first few months to kind of help energize and shape our work. But as soon as we began meeting, we recognized right away that we had some gaps in our committee, and we decided to outreach and invite representatives from the Office on Aging, higher education, faith-based organizations, the K through 12 system, and other key organizations to join our efforts. And we've had several folks join us since. So thank you to those people who have come on to help us. We did focus our initial work on getting ourselves oriented to the strategic approaches and goals of our specific subcommittee so that we had a common language to work from. And one of the first things that we recognized was that suicide prevention for a county of our size is a huge task. And so we wanted to target and focus our initial efforts and work towards populations in our community that were most vulnerable and at risk. So one of the first things that we did was we requested a presentation from our data folks related to suicide information for Riverside County. And based off of that data for our county, along with other considerations that our committee brought up, our team actually identified youth 10 to 14 and the elderly as two of the populations that we wanted to target our initial early efforts with. So that was really, really helpful. So just to remind folks, the two primary strategies under Upstream are building healthy and connected communities and promoting resiliency. And now I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Shore, who's going to talk to you about some of the action items that we've undertaken as a part of our committee work.
Thank you, Cherie. We've had an awesome team and I'm really, really excited. So, and Cherie gave me these notes, so I'm really excited about that. So when we began meeting, we really recognized that we needed to implement and identify programs that enhance connectedness and engagement. And these programs would likely increase protective factors and decrease risk factors for our target populations. And as we started doing that, we saw some creative ways that we could connect our youth with our elderly, and that became our primary focus. And one of the things that we believe is that by joining these two high-risk groups together, that we can accomplish some great goals and showing them resilience of each other and building simultaneously increase connectedness, create purpose, and decrease isolation for both groups. Many ideals are being considered to accomplish this, and some ideals include creating new programming that we could facilitate with things like pen pal programs, letter writing, creating video letters, videos with messages of resilience, and even PSAs. And some of our ideals include expanding on existing established programming through Office of Aging, Public Health, and other key organizations like AVID, dealing with many of our school districts, charter and public, youth advisory councils, and community senior centers. So to ensure that our efforts and activities are tailored to those specific cultures and values, we are being especially thoughtful about the modalities that we select and how we're using media and how, the accessibility of media in both populations. So we are exploring other ideas too to meet the goals of connectedness. For instance, to promote a sense of belonging, we could expand peer support networks for at-risk populations. Think things like faith groups, youth summer programs, things like that. And we can also increase the ability to access help. We could promote and support the expansion of mental health awareness and stigma reduction campaigns like Each Mind Matters and Up to Riverside. We could also access and expand upon the large cache of PEI materials that address awareness and stigma and share those with all of our targeted audiences. So if you remember, one of our things is promoting resiliency. And one of the things that we felt that we could do in the way that we're defining that is to promote effective programs and practices that enhance protective factors by teaching coping and problem-solving skills and strengthening internal supports that promote resilience. One of the ways that we are doing that is we're really excited and proud that we are intentional in the effort and we walk the talk. So in the beginning of each of our meetings, we take a moment and we start talking to each other, and we are promoting free culture, looking at how to reduce stigma and discrimination through open dialogue about mental health and just the way that we feel and how to strengthen our resilience. What we see is in our group that we actively discuss and address difficult topics, modeling respect and understanding, and often teaching each other resilience and how to deal in different situations. One of the most exciting strategies coming from our work group are our planned efforts to help our target population build skills that promote resiliency. These skills can include things like critical thinking, communication skills, conflict resolution, help seeking, and coping skills. We can broadly classify or think about these as emotional intelligence or SEL skills. So it's true to our form, we started ourselves by taking emotional intelligence test ourselves so that we could understand what it meant, how it's being measured, and what it means in our lives so that we can see how we can implement it in our programming. And we are still in the planning stages, but for our elderly population, we will begin to identify ways to bring more emotional intelligence training and development into their area. And for our youth experts on the team, we learned that 12 through K schools have pretty robust SEL strategies for students, but one place where we can expand would be in training and supporting parents and the ability to understand and nurture the SEL information that they're getting from their students and their school, trying to make it more comprehensive. This is an area where we are really see a lot of opportunity to collaborate with the Engaging Schools Subcommittee. We'd also like to consult and collaborate with our self-messaging subcommittee, something that we've learned about that stayed with us from the first coalition meeting was the importance of careful and safe messaging. So we want to build that in. And finally, one additional promising strategy we are working with is how to best assess and leverage trauma-related work being done in our county. One part for us is to start with the Riverside Resilience Project. The purpose of the Resilience Project is to empower communities and systems to prevent and mitigate the effects of trauma through education. Trauma-informed practices and strategies help build resilience in the individual, the organization, and at a community level. So right now, I want to thank you for giving us the time and the space for us to talk about all of the great things that we're doing with the Upstream Committee.
Wow, thank you for that impressive and thorough update. You guys have been doing a ton of work. And one of the things I really appreciate about what you both shared is really beginning to see those points of collaboration, not only across our subcommittees, so that we have this unified, coordinated approach to suicide prevention, but even beyond our coalition and looking at other existing things happening, thereby stacking and building upon existing successes already in our county will help us go so much farther, so much faster. So terrific. I'm really excited to see what's next for this committee and for our whole coalition altogether. So now for the first work group in our prevention subcommittee, trainings. The strategic plan outlines the goals in this strategic approach to increase detection and screening to connect people to services based on suicide risk. This encompasses trainings to increase effectiveness of suicide risk screenings, assessments, and trauma-informed practices, and trainings to support identification and intervention to effective care. So I'll turn to Tashani and Stephanie. Can you share your updates?
Thank you so much for that. Currently, we're working on with our subcommittee group on educating the community by bringing awareness to suicide prevention. This is conducted through the increasing community knowledge and recognizing the signs of suicide, as well as asking for help and reducing the negative stigma of suicide. Overall, it's to promote the wellness by encouraging that early intervention. So right now, our subcommittee is working on collecting everyone's individual knowledge on suicide prevention and intervention resources, as well as trainings out there that's accessible to the public, and familiarizing the group with the same trainings and resources so we can all start on the same page. Moving forward, we're also creating an information sheet that includes signs of suicide and key resources. There's a lot of information out there for suicide prevention. The problem is that there isn't much access to the material, and many people do not access the material unless they come across the subject of suicide. We want to increase everyone's knowledge in general of it, knowing that there are resources and trainings out there. Right now, so with the information sheet, we are including just the signs of suicide and key resources available to the public. And on that information sheet, we're also adding the QR code that guides the individuals through accessing that suicide prevention trainings and resources more in depth, and particularly the group that it references. For example, the youth, elderly, or even parents. We want it to be collective. So the information sheet will be available across all sectors. So that can be with provider offices, because as also identified in the training that we just received earlier, there are providers who aren't confident in suicide prevention or know what to do in that case. We identified that with the health plan that we work with. So we want to give them access to those tools and resources too, as well as engaging the religious communities, letting them know that there also are resources out there and connecting them with it, if of course they are accepting of it. Homeless shelters, food banks, schools. So that means partnering with our other strategic focus under the prevention committee. So engaging schools, social media. So hopefully we can partner in or promote effective messaging and communication subcommittee, as well as neighborhoods. So a lot of our students are having school online through homes, as well as parents don't know what to do. They're seeing a lot more signs of suicide ideation amongst their children because of the whole remote learning. So we want to engage everyone collectively. So right now, again, as stated, the subcommittee is working on collecting all the resources that we have accessible through all of us. And what we're doing is creating that one guided sheet and as well as expanding the knowledge of it through all community bases that is accepting of that information. So our next meeting that we will have in February, we will all be collecting all of the information that was already submitted to our clerical support, and then we will be creating that document live.
Terrific. Yeah, we'll want to make sure that you're definitely connected in with the calendar of trainings that we currently have going on in the community, so we can spread that reach and make sure that we get as many community members trained up as possible. So thank you for that update.
Thank you so much. And so we're moving on into our second work group in the prevention subcommittee, which is engaging schools. And the goal of the strategic approach is to standardize policies and curriculum to promote connectedness and address suicide risk. This includes the implementation of programs that foster social emotional growth, development and implementation of standardized suicide risk assessment tools and prevention plans, and to assist schools with the implementation of trauma-informed practices. So we have Dr. Sarmiento and Matthew here with us who can share a little bit about what the group has been working on.
All right, good morning. So what we're working on with engaging schools is three main goals. The first is consistent, standardized, and effective implementation of Ed Code Section 215 and other mental health policies across the district. The second one is support implementation of evidence-based strategies such as social emotional learning and mindfulness to enhance youth academic achievement and wellness, decrease risky behaviors, and improve relationships with peers and teachers to increase student engagement and connectedness. The third and last goal that we're focusing on is reviewing existing suicide prevention youth programs and providing a recommended list of districts to facilitate that every school has at least one youth program on campus to increase youth engagement. So what we're really focusing on with number one so far is make schools more adaptive to these policies and coming up with specific prevention policies. With goal number two, we're really looking at evaluating the different social emotional learning tools that are out there right now that are within the schools and trying to find one that we can more so look at to implement across the board. And then with regards to the final one, we're looking at emailing out to learn about what programs are currently out there with regards to youth programs and finding similar and known programs to try to assist with the training piece of our youth, which would connect us to the other work group that was previous, which is the training part, and really trying to just learn about what's kind of out there and survey what we can do to really engage the school community as well.
Awesome, thank you for that update. Okay, so next up is our intervention subcommittee with strategic approaches of means safety and the expansion and integration of suicide prevention in health services. Means safety includes the goals of delivering best practices in care targeting suicide risk, consisting of providing information to caregivers and family members on how they can support a person at risk and help plan for safety, as well as the goal of creating safe environments by reducing access to lethal means, which consists of implementing activities to reduce access to lethal means for individuals thinking about suicide. And then the expansion and integration of suicide prevention and health services includes the goals of delivering a continuum of crisis services across the county, evaluating crisis services to identify gaps and potential funding sources, and the goal of ensuring continuity of care and follow-up after suicide-related services, which includes the facilitation of safe, timely, and effective transitions to ongoing care. So here to share about this subcommittee's work thus far is Jim and Ioana.
Good morning. We identified our work group goals as identifying current services and interventions countywide. And we've been meeting monthly, and we quickly identified that there was knowledge and experiences in every region. So we developed subcommittees. We broke out in those regional subcommittees, and we are working to identify services, crisis services in each region. We're looking at crisis services, specialty services, outpatient clinics, specific age group services, substance abuse services, housing resources, and others resources including rescue missions, housing resources, substance abuse services, specialty services like LGBT services and other cultural services in each region. We're looking at age groups, what kind of services they provide, do they hand off services to other agencies, and specifically what kind of services are involved in each setting. We quickly found out that we, as a committee, are really very aware of county services and maybe school-based services, but we're also reaching out to private services in each region to identify in the continuum of care what services they would be comfortable in providing, including prevention and postvention and short and long-term care following a crisis. We are going to look at what gaps of services there are and try to identify other people to be included in our committee. We've identified and added our CBAT supervisor, and we're looking at other services in that we can include, and even non-county, which is a huge issue in our committee. Ioana, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you did a good job, Jim,
okay.
Covering everything. So we're just trying to do a lot of outreach right now to fill those gaps with military and, like Jim said, some of those private sectors and law enforcement. We want to try to get them on board so we can try to align.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think now we're moving on to postvention focus. And our postvention subcommittee is really looking at expanding support and services following a suicide loss. Some of the strategies here are expanding support services for survivors of suicide loss and entering into MOUs with coroners and medical examiners to coordinate responses following a suicide loss. And so we have Dr. Miller and Brenda Scott here to share a little bit about what the subcommittee has been working on.
Good morning. So we have a wonderful committee with various stakeholders. We have several loss survivors on the committee, and we were able to have a deputy coroner be involved in our committee. We have TIP and AFSP and some faith at the table and NAMI as well. So we have decided that we would like the support for postvention to be a staggered support with a lot of survivors on the committee realizing, understanding that there is that need for the initial response support, but then later on a few weeks, a few months later on down the road. So what we have been doing is we've been comparing two different models. We had the New Hampshire NAMI that presented to our committee, and we're comparing the Connect model and the LOSS team model. We're going to be having the Fresno LOSS team to provide some information, and then we're going to reach out to our neighboring county in San Diego to also see what they're doing. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to look at what other folks have in place and then go from there. So what we would like to do is we would like to be able to decide by the next quarterly meeting which we're going to go with. If we're going to go with Connect or a LOSS team. And because of the size of our county, that presents, unique challenges. We have very limited resources. Currently, Healing Conversations with American Foundation is available, and then TIP responds in Southwest Riverside County to suicides. But TIP is very willing and interested in incorporating post-vention training, and would like to be able to do at least one training by June of this year. We want to be able to train faith-based communities on loss support. And we also want to recruit specific peer support, as we know that's essential in post-vention, and be able to expand this throughout the communities throughout Riverside County. And let's see, is there anything else that I missed?
There's a question in the chat, I think, for the post-prevention group committee.
Okay, why don't we move into questions then, Jill? That was awesome. Thank you for that update. And we'll just move to questions. So if somebody can tell us the chat question.
It says, does the post-vention committee also address those who attempted suicide and survived, or just the family, friends that survived the suicide loss?
Thank you for reading that question. Post-vention is focused on the survivors of those who have been lost to suicide. So it's very specific when a suicide death has occurred. Other questions? Comments, feedback?
Anna, I think I have a response to that. I think that's a great question. I think as we look at intervention, it seems to me the folks who survived a suicide attempt would be part of what we're doing in terms of looking at the full continuum of care for someone. And as we're looking into culturally specific, after crisis care, I think it's important to, during some of our conversations, some of the providers have said, we're not an intervention, we're not a crisis intervention service, but we said, would you be an after crisis intervention service specific to the community? And many are saying yes. So that probably is part of our work, I would guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions or feedback?
There's another question in the chat. The question is, what are you doing to ensure transgender people are included?
Well, I can answer that. We reached out to the center. It's a LGBT transgender service in the desert, and we're also reaching out to a transgender service in Cathedral City. That is desert specific. We'll have to look, our subcommittees will have to look at services in their area to include it, but we are trying to look at everybody's culture and where they would fit in service. So we're trying to address that. we'll be bringing our information to, you know, the larger committee, and we certainly would welcome input. If we've missed anyone, we're trying not to. We have a pretty active subcommittee that it does challenge us to look at, you know, all areas, but we are certainly trying to include that.
Yeah, I think that goes for all the subcommittees, that we certainly need to have cultural lens for all of the cultural groups in our county, to ensure that all the way from messaging to the way we look at data, and into the kinds of support services that we offer as well, all the way through. Very important point.
I want to thank you, Tommy, as well for including the information that the Transgender Health and Wellness Center is now located in Riverside. I don't think there are some of us that weren't aware of that, and so that's really helpful to know that we have a resource we can connect with as well out in the western area of the county. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. So with about 7 minutes of time left, I want to make sure that we're giving opportunity not only for questions specific to our subcommittees, or questions for Noah, who's still with us, about his presentation, but really any kind of comments or feedback in general about the coalition overall. Now is a time that we can leave some space if anyone's got some thoughts or questions.
I have a question, Diana. Noah bringing up assist and mental health first aid and all of that stuff. I know those are trainings that are also generally done in person, and with COVID happening, we've not had access to those. Mm-hmm. Do you have any information on when we're going to be able to bring those back? And I was also curious, are those trainings, I know we're doing them here within behavioral health, are those for the community to come in and have access to them? Are those trainings also available like at the schools, you know, like the Safe Talk and within the public health departments as well?
Yes, so
awesome.
So correct, COVID has made it so that we're not able to offer in-person trainings at this time. I do not have a timeline of when we will get the permission to gather once again. As soon as we are able, we are ready to go. So we'll be talking with our executive leadership and with the public health department on the best safety practices when we're able to do that. So in the meantime, we have on offer 4 virtual trainings, one of which is Know the Signs, that is based on the suicideispreventable.org campaign. And so we do have some basic information about suicide prevention, and we have been offering that regularly since the start of COVID, and we'll continue to do so. All of those trainings, our full menu, not only includes those 4 virtuals, but it also the 3-hour Safe Talk, the 2-day assist, the 8-hour mental health first aid, we have both adult and youth version, are all available to anyone who lives or works in Riverside County completely for free. We offer them here at the Ruston Conference Center. We go to school sites, we go to organizations, all when we're able to do those things again, will be available once again to anyone that lives or works in Riverside County. And so those are some of the things we'll be definitely operationalizing with the training subcommittee. What we want to do is make sure that we're broadening who's getting access to those trainings. So these are an abundance, a rich source of evidence-based, high quality trainings that we need to do. What we need our training committee to help focus on is targeting the audience and going broader than to the partners we already have now. Who else needs it? The aim would be that we train every person that lives and works in Riverside County on some level of suicide prevention awareness and intervention, to be able to have that conversation. If there's a concern about someone, are you having thoughts of suicide? And then do I know how to help connect you? So we're really going to drive with the training group on how we expand who has access to those trainings and how we make them all aware of it. So it's a really great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other?
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Shore. I'm so stoked really about everything, but I just wanted to bring up, and I'm not sure where it is, and in my head, I'm sorry. Once we're doing this right now today, just now I got a call about a youth that is an elementaryr that is saying they're going to try to commit suicide from a school. And I have family members that I have had to go through this in the last couple of months, adult and youth. And once we hit the system is where my question comes for our coalition, because there are so many stops. And there are so many, we can call 211, but there are, still different things, and it doesn't seem to be a smooth resource. I'm sorry, I'm not saying this right, but there are challenges when we as consumers are trying to use the system, and we are trying to support people that are saying that they have suicidal ideation and have literally started trying to do things to themselves. And I'm wondering, how can we as a coalition support or help that? Once I'm very open, and I had to take one of my family members from place to place to place to place, and none of them would take them. So how do we support that?
Yeah, that's the most critical piece, isn't it? Sure, that's exactly what the intervention group is focused on. So I don't know, Jim, if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of things flood to my mind, but I think when crisis services are involved, there is some mandates about listening to a family member or a what we would call a reliable witness, and providing some history and some context for what that person is going through, that might increase the interventions from the provider, that might lead to service intervention that I think you were referencing. I think supporting that person to follow through with treatment following a crisis is a pretty important aspect as well. I think a lot of times we're good in the county about doing crisis services. I think we've identified in our subcommittee the follow-up after a crisis is sometimes a struggle. So encouraging a family member to support that person to follow through with treatment. And we are working on that as a committee to try to improve that, and to identify services and follow-up services for people who have county Medi-Cal and can resource our services, but also folks who are who don't have county Medi-Cal and maybe have a private insurance that might have less services available to them. And those are my immediate thoughts. Anybody else?
Thank you, Jim.
Sure, since this is a student who's in elementary school, reaching out to the school to provide support as well, because they also have to hold a re-entry meeting. If the student is evaluated after the fact, developed a safety plan. So I would definitely have them reach out to the school as well.
I gave the lady 211 and told her to reach the county, and that the county would support her as she's trying to support her student. I hope that was exactly what I was supposed to do. That's what I've been told. So I told her 211, and so somebody got a call this morning, and hopefully, it's all going to be taken care of. So I appreciate you for that. It's just when we as just people in the community come across this issue, I know one of our subcommittees is dealing with that. I just feel it's so important, and I know I'm not the only one that's had to deal with this in my family, but it's so important, even if I cannot find services and I'm in the field, for people, and Jim, you said it, people with insurance are really at risk. I think that it's easier for people without insurance than those who have insurance. And I'm wondering, how can we fix that, you know, to where people with insurance have as much support? And we don't have to discuss it. It's just, thank you for what you're saying.
Yeah, well, and a valid point. It brings to light probably some additional partners we need to have on this coalition, that we really are including all members of our community and what their access is and what are they doing around suicide prevention, and are they on board with this strategic plan. So there's a few more things to think about who to include. So I am aware of the time, and I know some folks have been leaving us. I can stay for a little bit longer for any additional questions, but I want to remind you all that we have our next quarterly meeting on April 28th at 9 a.m. Be on the lookout for that invitation. And if you are not already involved in one of our subcommittees and would like to be, please email us at pei@ruhealth.org to get connected to one of our 6 subcommittees. Thank you all so much for your time and attention today, and have a great rest of your day. And I look forward to our continued work and progress around suicide prevention. Thank you so much.
Thank you.